Okay. Hi, everyone. Hopefully now you can see my screen. As Tess mentioned, my name is Austin Thompson, and today I'm going to be talking about innovations in water systems, specifically looking at barriers and case studies, both from Appalachia and that could be analogous to communities that exist both in Appalachia and are like some of these Appalachian communities that we see. So Tess gave you a little bit of background on me, but just to kind of lengthen that a little bit because I am relatively new to the Environmental Finance Center. I started there last June. Basically, I've been here for about a year now, and I manage a few projects outside of just the Smart Management for Small Water Systems project, and that's really what is kind of drawing in some of the similar research that you'll be seeing today. Today's webinar is going to blend findings from another project that I'm on that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, related to water and wastewater infrastructure, directly related to small water systems in Appalachia. So today's content will focus on exactly what the title implies, so barriers and case studies on innovations in water systems. And just as a disclaimer before we get started, this webinar is very much a 10,000-foot view of innovations. It's not intended to be an endorsement of any specific innovation or to be comprehensive. It's really just intended to give systems an idea of what's out there and how different communities have implemented these innovations and what that's looked like in each individual community. Okay, so just to lay the groundwork for today's webinar, I'm going to walk through a few key concepts, but before I do, I want to define some terms that I'll be tossing around just to make sure that everyone's on the same page. So first, what I'll talk about generally is how I define Appalachia. So I've already mentioned Appalachia a couple times, but unless you're actually from that region, you may or may not know exactly what I mean in terms of the geographical bounds. And then based on that, I'll talk a little bit more about the project that I'm working on. And then from there, I'll just talk about generally what I mean by innovation. So, this is a term that is thrown around a lot, but it doesn't necessarily have a clear definition, so I'll go into that a little bit more. And then from there, I'll move into really the meat of the webinar, which is the common barriers to innovation and then those case studies that I've mentioned. So first, just starting off with how we define Appalachia. So before I started the project that was kind of lending some of this research, I really thought of Appalachia as an area around the Appalachian Mountains, home of the Appalachian Trail, and really just the site of some scenic vistas like any of these photos that can be seen on the screen right now. And while these photos are all from the Appalachian region, I made sure whenever I pulled them in, the region is so much more than just the rich natural environment. It is the mountains, it is these waterfalls, it is these large water bodies, but the people there are also a fundamental part of what makes Appalachia, Appalachia. So going into how we define Appalachia, again, the communities are a lot of what makes it such a unique place. They vary widely in terms of size, population, topography, capacity, income, and these towns are just a few towns within Appalachia. 3 happen to be within West Virginia, and 1 within North Carolina, but they're analogous to much of the region. Appalachia has very small towns like Oakville, which is in the bottom left-hand corner, which according to the U.S. Census had a population of 121 people in 2010, and also very large cities like Asheville, which is pictured on the right, which the population was about 84,000 in 2010. It includes towns with population growth and population decline, towns with strong economies, and towns that are really struggling to find the next industry, and in addition to the coal towns that may or may not be closing. So Appalachia has a unique set of characteristics and challenges, but in short, its diversity is not unlike the rest of the United States. Okay, so thinking about this webinar and the research that I am basically doing and showing to y'all here, I'll be talking about Appalachia as it's been outlined by the Appalachian Regional Commission. Mainly, I've found out from folks since I started this project, namely those from Appalachia, those people are familiar with Appalachian Regional Commission or ARC, but some aren't. So I'm just going to kind of go over it generally just so everyone's on the same page, because the way ARC sees Appalachia is the way I'm thinking about Appalachia for this webinar. So Appalachia was established by an act of Congress in 1965 as part of the War on Poverty. It's a regional economic development entity basically comprised of 13 states and a federal co-chair that's appointed by the president. ARC works with each individual state and at a lower level with local development districts in each of those states to help provide additional capacity to towns in need and also to undertake some of the grant process. So the local development districts are really the boots on the ground that provide the knowledge for the projects. ARC itself gets congressional appropriations and then invests that in projects in Appalachia. And these projects basically just need to align with its strategic goals, including water and wastewater infrastructure as part of that third goal that's listed there as critical infrastructure. And in fiscal year 2018, the ARC invested in 522 projects across all of its strategic goals of approximately $125 million. So when I'm talking about kind of the geographic bounds, this is what I'm talking about. So this is the way the ARC sees Appalachia. From their perspective, it stretches all the way from Mississippi and Alabama up to the southern part of New York, and it covers 13 states and 420 counties. And each county is given an economic designation in every fiscal year, and that's what you can see in the map on the right. And that's just basically based on how the county compares to national averages on unemployment, percent poverty, and income. And the counties labeled distressed, which you can see are the red counties, which kind of, concentrate around, it looks like mainly Kentucky, are the ones that qualify for a greater percent of project funding to be covered by ARC, should that project meet ARC's strategic goals and the priorities of each of the member states. Okay, so we've defined Appalachia. So why talk about Appalachia? Well, the reason we're talking about Appalachia is because another project that we're doing, which I mentioned previously, is a program evaluation of a portfolio of projects related to water and wastewater infrastructure. As part of that project, we're looking more in depth at each of those individual projects within that portfolio, but also we're charged with looking at innovations in water systems. So really and truthfully, although this content is really directed at Appalachia, because Appalachia represents so many small systems and very similar demographics to other systems across the country, the content just seemed like it was appropriate for a broader audience. Okay, so first polling question, so I'll actually pass it back over to Tess, but I'm just curious what you guys think of when you hear innovation.
So you should all be seeing a poll, and it says, what do you think when you hear innovation? So select all that apply: new, unusual, unproven, expensive, or other. And we'll give you just a couple more seconds to put in your response. Looks like almost everyone has, but if you need a few more seconds, we will give you just a couple more to get your response done. And I'm going to close this poll in 3, 2, and 1. Right, and in terms of the results, it looks like 89% of everyone on the call today says that when they think of innovation, they think of something new. 52% say they think of something unusual. 30% say unproven. Only 9% are saying expensive, and then we do have 20% who are thinking of other things as well.
Great, thank you, Tess. Okay, so you guys, I actually really like the fact that only 9% said expensive. That's obviously a good thing whenever you're thinking about innovations, because a lot of times when people think of innovations, they think of things right off the bat that are just cost prohibitive. So it's good that that's not necessarily what y'all are thinking. So I did just want to kind of go through how I'm defining innovation for the purposes of this webinar and for this research generally. So what I put on the screen here are just screenshots. You have the Merriam-Webster definition, which is the introduction of something new. So kudos to everyone who said new. And then, Google has this kind of unhelpful one that is the action or progress of innovating, but also a new method, idea, product, etc. So the main thing that I'm thinking about when I'm talking about innovations here is just something outside of the norm. So it could be new. It could be, unproven, but it could also be something that people are relatively familiar with, but just don't implement or have heard about, but haven't really seen ground truth. So for the purposes of this webinar, many things may be examples that you're familiar with, but some may be totally foreign. The idea is that these examples are not things that you hear about every day and are thus a slightly different idea, or at least a more in-depth look at something that you've heard about but you don't know a ton about. So for the purposes of the evaluation, we're thinking about innovations in 4 buckets. So we're thinking about design, technology, financing, partnerships. Me personally, I'm not an engineer. I have a background in environmental economics, so I won't be diving into any specific facts on the engineering aspects of innovation. But as the webinar goes on, after the fact, if anyone has any questions, they're more than welcome to email me, and I can provide them with resources or point them to someone who has engineering experience, or point them to the actual resources that I've been using to put this together. That's just another little disclaimer. Oh, sorry, I skipped over my polling question. So you may have seen the next slide, in which case you might already know potential answers, but this is my next polling question, which is, what do you see as common barriers to innovation?
Great. So if you can take a look at the polling question, you'll see that you can select any of the following options. That includes regulation, risk, available funding, if you're unsure of what's out there, or something else, which would be the other option. So take a couple more seconds to tell us what you see as common barriers to innovation, and then we'll go ahead and share the results. Looks like almost everyone has put in their response, so I'm just going to close this poll in 3, 2, and 1. And just to take a look at the results, it looks like the majority of people put regulation and risk. 65% of everyone put those 2 down. Available funding had 68%. And unsure had 45, and other had 20. So there's kind of a lot of, there's sort of even, it was even across the board how people were thinking of barriers.
Okay, that's great. So yes, I really appreciate everyone kind of giving feedback on what you see as some of the barriers. Obviously, I had it pretty scripted by having it as, you know, a certain number of barriers that were shown there. But you know, there are obviously a lot of barriers to implementing innovations, a lot of which, specifically for small systems, can be a serious hurdle. So that's really valuable feedback. And I'll be addressing kind of each of these generally, and you may, you know, as we dive into the actual case studies, see both some of these barriers in action as well as some ways to overcome them. So, barriers to innovation. Basically, innovation is kind of hard to come by within the water sector. There's the whole capacity issue. You know, budgets are tight. There's an aging workforce, and there's obviously political pressure related to rates. And there's a need to meet many masters, and also just make sure that you're continuing to provide safe, affordable drinking water. And that can just be at odds sometimes with thinking outside the box. Also, sometimes it seems like our regulation and sometimes funding is set up that it sort of disincentivizes innovation, and not to mention the fact that we have this whole concept of state fragmentation. So there's just consistency in terms of what states are really interested in and pursuing in terms of infrastructure from state to state. So it can make it hard to really capitalize on innovations on a grander scale that can help reduce some of the costs that we're talking about. And again, these are just some of the examples of barriers to innovation, and many more do exist. So as I kind of dive into these, you know, just keep in mind that this is just, you know, a few, and there are others, but hopefully they can be overcome. So first, just starting off with risk. So first of all, what is risk? You guys obviously know to a certain extent, because most of you responded that that was one of the concerns, but it's basically just exposure to harm or loss, and sometimes it can be at odds with winning big. So if you think about a risky investment, it might have a big potential payout, but it can also have a big potential for loss. And water utilities tend to be pretty risk averse, and that's completely understandable. You know, you've got things like public health, public trust and security. You've got issues of the cost of being out of compliance, and it could, in general, just cause a disruption to the treatment or distribution of water. And these utilities are fully responsible for any mishaps. So there are risks involved, and they're pretty serious risks. So it's somewhat understandable that this is one of the major barriers to innovations within the water sector. Next up is costs. So most of you, well, not most of you, I can't remember the exact percentage, but costs weren't a large portion of people's responses. But innovations can be pricey, specifically if it's something like a new design, new technology, or some major shift in the way that you're doing business. It can require pretty significant upfront costs, as well as just capital in general to implement the new technology. But some grants and loans do exist that could help with this. But it does require the capacity, the local capacity to both apply for these grants and loans and to just look into innovations in general. So there are those costs as well. Next up is regulation and funding. So funding kind of falls in with costs in general, but from a regulation standpoint, water utilities, I don't have to tell anyone on this webinar, they're under strict regulation and compliance expectations. So finding money can be tough, just making sure that you're meeting those standards and not incurring any additional costs can also be pretty prohibitive. But it's important to think about the fact that when I'm talking about innovations, I'm also talking about innovations in financing and innovations in partnerships. In these innovations, it's not technology, it's not a specific design. So in terms of the risks, the cost, the regulation, they shouldn't really fall on the side of issues with compliance with, the Safe Drinking Water Act. They might just require, again, some capacity to think outside the box and to pursue avenues that you wouldn't otherwise pursue. And finally, there's state fragmentation, which I kind of mentioned earlier, but it just kind of leads to fragmentation in the innovation itself. States have separate water management, infrastructure funding, and just general priorities. And there's also, as everyone knows on this line, there's many water systems in the United States, many of which are small. So it's harder to capitalize on some of these, regional innovations that might work on a larger scale. Okay, so with that, I'm going to transition from innovations to the actual case studies. So basically, up until now, I talked about more scholarly examples as to why it might be challenging to innovate. But there are other things that can be pursued outside of just these kind of scary things that you might hear about on the news. That's obviously can be a prohibitive thing. The media likes to highlight things that go wrong and not necessarily the things that go right. So I hope that through the next slides, through the next examples, I can show some of the cases where things went right and maybe some cases where things went right, but some hurdles came up along the way, but it ended up okay. So hopefully this webinar will provide a little bit more optimism in terms of how to overcome some of these barriers and how to be a little bit innovative. Okay, so moving on to case studies. So these case studies will hopefully provide some interesting examples of what's out there with little capacity or effort involved. But before we start, just a disclaimer, again, this webinar is not intended to be endorsement of any innovative solution, and they're just examples, all of which have pros and cons and may or may not be appropriate given the situation at your system. So it's just important to keep that in mind. Just because it works out at one system does not necessarily mean it's right for yours, or vice versa. If it did work out for someone else and you were to pursue it, it could be something that's right for you. But again, it's just something to keep in mind. Okay, so actually diving into the case studies. I'm sure everyone's probably like, finally. Okay, so we'll start with a really interesting case study out of Kentucky. It's the Kentucky Water Kiosk case study is kind of how I'm calling it. So the first thing I wanted to do for these case studies is just start with some background on the community. But before I do, just to give you a little bit of background on the case study itself, it's more of a design case study. So we'll be looking into kind of an innovative design and idea of providing drinking water in an area that otherwise, just was too rural, was too mountainous to abide by kind of the usual provision of drinking water. So first, just to start, I went to Google Maps and I typed in Redbird Water Kiosk, Kentucky, and this is what came up. So it's pretty rural. Obviously, this is pretty zoomed in, so it's hard to tell. So I decided to zoom out a little bit. and see if maybe that would give me a better idea of what this area looked like. Again, even at this kind of level of being zoomed out, you can tell that it's mountainous, you can tell that it's rural. It's a little unclear the size of the neighboring towns, but again, this is obviously a really small community. It's not a densely populated area. This final map kind of helps give a little bit more context on the location of where I'm talking about. Basically, it's north of Knoxville. It's east of the Daniel Boone National Forest. But again, this doesn't give you a lot of context on who lives there, on what the community actually looks like, or what I'm actually talking about. So that's kind of where I'm going to transition to next. So to give a little bit more background on the community, I picked Beverly, Kentucky when I was looking at the population sizes, just because it was the closest community nearby. But again, I just wanted to show side-by-side kind of satellite images here. On the left, you've got, that is the Redbird mission. That's the site of the water kiosk. And on the right, you have London, Kentucky. And London, Kentucky, while it does have some, a population of about 8,000, is a little bit larger. It's still relatively small. It's not super highly populated, but you can just tell by looking at these two satellite images how little infrastructure exists near the Redbird mission site. To think more generally, Clay County, which is where this water kiosk is, in 2010, the population was about 21,000, and the median household income was about 16,000. And approximately 39.7% of the population was living below the poverty line. It was known as one of the poorest counties in the United States, and in 2010, the Washington Post called Clay County the unhealthiest county in Kentucky, and New York Times called it one of the hardest places to live in the United States. So, sorry to start off with a little bit of pessimism, but it really sets the stage for kind of how this all came about and why the innovation was so successful here. So what led to the implementation of this innovation? Generally speaking, what was the problem? So I already talked about how small the population was, but it also had a bit of a declining population, low median household income. There were pretty serious water access problems, not to mention there were watershed contamination problems. So there was some water testing conducted between 2012 and 2014, and 64% of the testing sites exceeded the EPA standards for E. coli. Basically, it's a difficult region for septic systems, given the steep terrain in the soil itself. So there are some concerns about straight piping and human waste kind of making its way into surface water, which was contaminating some of the surface water in the surrounding area. And in addition, many people within the community were on private wells, which was kind of making it challenging from a public health and monitoring standpoint, because there was really no way to ensure that their water was safe to drink. And actually, previously in the community, they had tried to undertake a similar distribution strategy to a water kiosk. Actually, years ago, there was a local church that built a well water kiosk, but there was heavy usage and the church wasn't charging for the water, so they couldn't afford some of the actual monitoring that the state required, and the overuse drained the well. So that previous effort failed, unfortunately. But based on that, the community decided to reach out. So they actually reached out to the University of Tennessee, and a big group of, a very kind of interdisciplinary group, a lot of different backgrounds came together and kind of tried to see out the process. So the team's goals in general were just to share knowledge with the community, to look at the problem holistically, so the biological, the social, the environmental health standpoints of the actual problem. And the team determined that there was an urgent need for access to clean water, just because of the myriad of environmental and water quality issues that they saw while they were there. And there was also concerns about the connection between clean water access and health, particularly the health of Clay County, which Washington Post described as one of the unhealthiest counties in Kentucky, as well as the fact that because people, weren't confident in the quality of their water, they were seeking out things like sodas instead, and there were some concerns about diabetes and obesity in the community. So it was a lot of problems all kind of combining to kind of lend itself to this innovation. So who was involved? It's described as a community academic partnership. So basically, based on an extensive stakeholder analysis, the team decided to bring a lot of different groups to the table. So the actual team members, which folks from the nursing department, the architecture department, engineering department, law enforcement, as well as folks from the Kentucky Waterways Alliance, local leaders, and then also state and federal leaders. They tried to do everything that they could to bring together a pretty diverse group. In addition to that, the Redbird Mission, which is a local faith-based organization, and a local emergency management service were included on the team as well. And that was with the understanding that basically this project fell under a specific project actually called the Appalachia Community Health and Disaster Preparedness Project, which was part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which was designed to protect communities against disaster. So that's why we saw some of these emergency management services, and the idea was that we were making more resilient communities. So in terms of who was involved, that mix of stakeholders that were at the table in the beginning were also involved in the design, the construction, and the funding of the project. The project itself was funded from the United Methodist Committee on Relief and Private Donations. And then the University of Tennessee partnered with the Redbird Mission, with emergency services, with elected officials, with teachers. In the design and construction, again, it was a community effort. It was led by the folks at University of Tennessee at Knoxville, but they really tried to bring in the community to create a space that people would be proud of. So what was the result of this community engagement? They went through, they assessed the infrastructure, the disaster preparedness, the distribution of the community in the area. They did water sampling, they assessed community health, and they also did a water knowledge survey. And based on all of this information, they established target areas for interventions that would maximize the impact. They looked where people without municipal water supply lived, and also what kind of water supply they used, and it was a mix. So people were using natural springs, wells, and some people actually just had a pipe running from an embankment with flowing surface water. And based on that specifically the last part of that, the surface water portion, there were significant concerns about contamination. This used to be a mining community. A lot of people had failing septic tanks, and there's also that question of straight piping. So they conducted a community survey, and basically, like I said earlier, it just showed that there was a really dire need to figure out a solution to get clean drinking water to these folks, both in times of emergency and in the normal day-to-day. So on a qualitative basis, there were really two parts to this whole approach. There was a qualitative approach and a quantitative approach. And the qualitative approach really just showed that they needed to address the water access challenge. So the topographical and income challenges made the traditional provision nearly impossible. And the town itself said, or the county rather, said that there were few plans to run water lines to some of these more remote areas. The barriers were just too high, both in terms of cost and in terms of the actual design and technology. And not to mention the fact that there had been some efforts to extend municipal water lines along main roads, but the homeowners are responsible for paying that hookup fee, and were just unable. The cost was just too high given the income of the folks that were in this community. And these access challenges are just really due to, in addition to all the things I already mentioned, things like poverty, neglect, vulnerability, as well as just the sparse population. So moving on to the more quantitative side, they asked some pretty strategic questions on the survey. It only had 30 responses, but it was a household level response. Basically, they were asking how many folks had plumbing in their homes, how many had access to municipal water, and then they did some actual water testing. So as you can see from the survey results, 17% didn't have a flushable toilet, and 36% used a private well. And obviously, this is just a sample. It's not the entire community, but hopefully it's representative. And the water sampling that they did 18 different water samples, 2 of which were thrown out, but these are the sampling sites. Again, context is probably not, unless you're really familiar with this area, it's probably not super helpful looking at this map, but it does show that they explored kind of a pretty vast area in terms of trying to find the best one. Number 18, which is, if you can see my mouse is right here, that was the Redbird mission site, and it was the only site with an absence of both fecal coliform and E. coli. So moving on from kind of the background, we're kind of getting into the actual innovation now. So what did the design look like? And as the University of Tennessee, as that team was collaborating on this, they really wanted to create a place that had a sense of community, that met all of the needs, but also was easy to access. So basically what they did was they kind of came up with a group of ideas, and this is the one that they went with. So they tried to keep access to it. So keeping it adjacent to the road so that people could get to it easily. They put a cover on it so that in case people, walked up and wanted to get water, they had a place to stand if it was raining or if the weather was poor. They also added what they considered a community aspect, which was 4 bays added to the side of the actual water kiosk so that they could conduct a local farmers market there in hopes that that would be a place that people had identity, which is the last one. And again, they just added a wooden screen. Basically, they just tried to dress it up a little bit so it felt like a place that people were proud of and would consider a place that they would visit. And basically, an environmental engineer who was on the team and had actually experience with water kiosks in developing countries helped guide discussions with some of the community partners to gain approval for this system. And the idea was to tap into an existing county line that was routinely monitored for purity and for fluoride content. So what does the finished product look like? So actually, students at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville were the ones that kind of came up with these design concepts. So it started with 5 design concepts, and based on community input, they tried to create a community space. So this was very much a back and forth with community members to try to ensure that they had their say in what the final product would look like. And it was actually built over an alternative spring break. So I don't know how many people are familiar with that, but it's basically over spring break, undergraduate students basically do some sort of like service learning experience. So in this case, those students went out and actually built this kiosk. So kind of going into more what does it look like, the next few slides are really just photos of the finished product. So this is just looking at it from the side, and you can see that there's some benches around the back, places for people to gather, as well as a sign that says Redbird on it. And this is the other side, kind of talking generally if you're thinking about the design photo that I just showed. You've got the rain barrel here, you've got the benches, you've got the bays for the farmer's market, and you can see that it's running really just adjacent to the road there. And kind of the question is, who was or is served by this? So because of this kiosk, basically according to the University of Tennessee's website, 9,000 families in Kentucky now have access to clean, fresh water. In total, 150 people worked on this project, and it took 3 months to kind of dream up and figure out the design and implementation of this water kiosk. But it actually only took about 1 week, the alternative spring break, to actually build it. So the important part, right? I just told you a lot about the background, about the actual design itself, but what really matters is, can it be replicated? There are obviously some pretty serious limitations with this case study, particularly that water isn't provided within the home. There's still the expectation that people have to go and get water themselves. Also the fact that there were, local stakeholders were really invested in seeing this through. And they had familiarity with it because of the other water kiosks that they had implemented previously. Not to mention the fact that there was the Redbird mission that was willing to take on the challenge. But again, this is Appalachia. It was a rural community. It was a coal town. There were serious water quality issues, and all of this was really coming together to mean that innovation was necessary if people wanted access to clean water. So although you don't hear about water kiosks too much within the United States, it is something that for this community was essentially the only choice. So we're the EFC, Environmental Finance Center. And we knew that the costs were prohibitive during the first try, and that's why it didn't really succeed. So how are they paying for it? This is actually straight from the Redbird Missions website. It's a screenshot of it. It says, safe, clean water filling station provided at a minimal cost of 5 gallons for a quarter. And it's located across from the community store. Obviously, it's not a super detailed description, but that's how they're paying for it. And also, if folks don't have clean water containers, they do have that link there. So they do provide those as well for people who might come up and need water but not have anything to store it in. So to date, we've largely seen these, like I was saying previously, in developing countries. But for communities with a unique set of challenges, it could be feasible. This was something that, as I was kind of doing my research and reading more about it, this was something that folks who worked at the University of Tennessee and community members wanted to see in other places, specifically communities they were aware of that had similar challenges. So it could be something that we see more of in the future. The idea was that the architectural drawings, the design could be shared and implemented in other regions that had similar concerns. So with that, I'm going to move into the second case study, which is a little bit different. And it's basically what I'm considering a non-traditional partnership model. And it's a nonprofit called Dig Deep that's located, or their headquarters is in downtown Los Angeles. You may or may not have heard of them. They've gotten a lot of media attention from NPR, from the New York Times. Also on their website, there's a video of Michael Phelps supporting them. So obviously, you know, they've reached a pretty wide audience. But basically, their goal is to address water access challenges in the United States, and that includes both the provision of water and then education and outreach. And based on their 2018 report, it says that they're 6, so I'm assuming that they've been around since about 2013. So how do they work? This is kind of just a very shallow look into their finances. So they call their finances the 100% model. So 100% of donations that are designed to go to water programs go to water programs. So if you go to their website and you click donate, that money is going towards funding water access or education and outreach related to clean water. And this is all in the United States. They also have this other group they call the Water Council, which you can see right here. And those are the folks that are funding some of their administrative costs. So if you join the Water Council and you're donating, you're not donating necessarily to the water projects themselves, but you are donating to the operations, to keeping Dig Deep afloat, essentially. And I don't know exactly the premise behind that, but I think a lot of it probably has to do with the concern of how much that people are actually donating are going to work that's on the ground. So this is their way of kind of looking at things and being transparent for folks that are investing. In terms of innovation, they actually won the U.S. Water Prize from the U.S. Water Alliance that has to do with water innovation. So as soon as I found that out, it basically seemed like I had to have them in this presentation because from the perspective of the U.S. Water Alliance, they are innovating. Okay, so looking at kind of generally what kind of money they have, how they're investing it, they started off in 2015 with spending about roughly $500,000 on water access and education projects. And then by 2018, they were investing in total about $1.1 million. Just related to water projects was about $1 million. And they consistently across the years spend about 87 to 88% on programs. And between 2016 and 2017 alone, they actually doubled in size. So they are growing in terms of their donations, and based on the research that I was doing, they are growing in terms of their impact as well. So just to look at it kind of generally by the numbers, these are kind of the projects that they're working on generally. And you're probably wondering to yourself, why am I talking about them? Do they work in Appalachia? What do they really do? They don't work in Appalachia, but they have worked in really rural areas. They're working on water access. They're working on educating folks. And all of these things are analogous to a lot of places throughout the United States, not just specifically, you know, the places that they're targeting their money. So they have 4 current projects. They have the Navajo Water Project. They have the Clean Water for St. Michael's Project. They have the Bring Baby Lisa Home Project, and then the 4 Liters Challenge. In general, their projects fall into 2 buckets. So they have the projects that I talked about previously, which was the water access projects, which are essentially them building and managing low-cost systems in what they consider a community-led solution. And then they also have education and advocacy projects, where they're trying to just connect people to their water, and try to, as they say, create a deep and lasting connection to the water we often take for granted. The project that I'm actually going to talk about in terms of the innovation is the Navajo Water Project. But the Clean Water for St. Michael's project is designed to get clean water to a special needs school. The third project was to try to get water and sewer to a home where a child had a serious illness. And then the fourth project is just that education and outreach. It's essentially aimed to help people recognize what living with water scarcity really looks like. Okay, let's talk about the Navajo Nation. First of all, it's huge. I don't know if people are aware of that. I feel like, you think about it expanding a pretty large area, but the Navajo Nation is really large. Not that this means anything, because 17 million acres doesn't mean much, but it's 17 million acres, so it's really large. In general, just kind of general context and background, population is about 350,000, but not very densely populated, only about 13 people per square mile. And the average household income as of 2016 was about $27,000. The average household size is about 3.5. Okay, so the actual project itself, what does it look like? So there is a link here that you can look at after the fact if you want to dig in more, but basically the problem that they're trying to address started with a smaller project, but it's since expanded now that they've realized how expansive the need is. According to their website, 40% of Navajo families have to haul water every day, and they pay 67 times more for the water they haul versus piped water. So they have what they design, or what they advertise as an innovative system, which is a community-managed utility alternative that brings hot and cold running water to homes without access to water or sewer lines. They describe it as the first system of its kind in the United States. Again, I'm not an engineer, but I do know, based on kind of, again, some information that I found throughout conducting these case studies, what that looks like. So these are the four parts that they describe as kind of their innovative system. So they create wells where they develop new sources where water is pumped, treated, and stored locally. They deliver water in food-grade trucks. They also create these home water systems that can provide up to a certain amount of hot and cold running water, and they use solar power. And then what they do, much like the Water Kiosk Project, is they really pull in the community. They make sure the community is a part of all of the decision-making along the lines of the actual project, so that they're invested in it and invested in the end result once Dig Deep is no longer there. And just for reference, they've raised about $485,000 to bring running water and solar power to a remote town in Utah within the Navajo Nation. So how replicable is this process? There are obviously pretty serious limitations. For one, there's not a lot of information on the actual system that they have implemented in terms of the engineering behind it. Again, I'm not an engineer, but even that was kind of coating the surface. In addition, they're a nationwide nonprofit, and the need is much more widespread than their ability to reach everyone. Even with a budget of about $1 million, it would be really challenging to meet everyone. Not to mention the fact that, the Navajo Nation is very unique, and the challenges there may or may not be analogous to some of the other areas of the United States. But it is a really interesting group that's trying to bring to light a lot of clean water access challenges in the United States. And they probably have a whole list of interesting contacts and great ideas. So in a sense, they're a non-traditional partnership because they're a group that's doing a lot within the field and seems really motivated to see measurable change. So I'm going to talk about this generally because I, for one, don't have a ton of time, and there are a couple other case studies that I really wanted to highlight. But NATO conducts a lot of projects that I would consider innovative. That link there is a link to essentially their website that kind of gives a general overview of this, but they've invested in a lot more innovative water infrastructure projects than I've just listed here. There are several more on their website. The most interesting one, I think, in my opinion, that's listed here, and that is actually analogous to Appalachia, is the Georgia LIDAR project. And just for people who don't know, LIDAR is a type of mapping technology. It stands for light detection and ranging. And basically, they coordinated a project that involved 22 counties, 3 cities, and 5 regional commissions, and they used LIDAR for flood mapping, and it also acquired data for infrastructure related to water, wastewater, stormwater, gas lines, things of that nature. So it's an interesting example of using an RDO, a regional development organization, as a partner on the actual project, and also implementing innovative technology to plan, to be more resilient, and to plan for infrastructure. It's just an interesting partnership that I was otherwise unaware of. So the next case study actually comes from the project portfolio that we have through ARC, and it's an example of an innovation based on state priorities. So basically, Birchtown, Tennessee, that's where this case study took place. It had a population of about 800 in 2010, and according to their records, they serve about 5,000 people, and we're suffering with pretty significant water loss. They're also considered a distressed county, so for ARC purposes, they qualify for more funding, but that also means that in terms of kind of their socioeconomic status, they're struggling relative to the rest of the United States. The project was completed in 2012. It was an ARC project. The total funding was about $625,000, but it was really aimed at addressing water loss. So they conducted a water loss survey between July 2009 and June 2010, and we're averaging about 45% water loss, and it was peaking at about 55%. And that was a huge financial burden, both the utility and obviously the ratepayers. So this case study, this example of a project was addressing water loss and recovering some of those costs. So the project itself, in terms of being a revenue case study, it both, addressed a problem, but also helped recover some of the costs associated with actually funding the infrastructure that was motivating this change in water loss. So this one's kind of cheesy. I'll go ahead and say that at the forefront. One of the things I always recommend is using your own data. Be innovative with your revenues by using data that you have on hand and that you can easily get. So basically, rate setting is it's very much an art. There are a lot of things that you can look at when you're considering setting your rates, looking at affordability, looking at things like inflation, looking at your billing records and consumption allowances. There are many, many ways that you can go. But just one kind of general case study, obviously this isn't an exact example of a case of that, but you can do it yourself. You can use data to think about crafting rates as an innovative financing tool. Where do you get that data? Well, some of it you probably have on hand, things like rates, but you can get census data on your community at data.census.gov. It used to be FactFinder, but they're transitioning to this website. And you can also get information on things like inflation from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and they think really regionally. So you can go and hit this down arrow right here, pick what you're interested in looking at, and pick your state, and they can help you get an idea of what costs look like in your area. Okay, so the final kind of group of case studies are related to partnerships again, but more so regionalizations and mergers. And they're going to be informed by this report from the U.S. Water Alliance, and there's a link at the bottom if you want to learn more after the fact. So the first case study, and really the one that I'm going to dive into, is the Logan Todd Regional Water Commission. And the reason I chose this one is because it's in Kentucky. Actually, ironically, it is literally just west of Appalachia, but it has some of the similar demographics and background. The outline of Appalachia is pretty set in stone, but that's not to say that the counties next door don't have similar issues. So just for some context, Logan County, the population in 2010 was about 26,000. Todd County, the population in 2010 was about 12,000. And they have about a similar median household income of around $30,000. So just for some background, the Logan Todd Regional Water Commission basically is where 12 systems came together to create a central treatment facility and then purchase wholesale from that facility in a hope that that would make water supply more reliable and also promote some of the economic development that is also at the heart of what ARC does. So leading up to this, there were pretty significant concerns about water quality and water shortages. They had a drought and water shortage issues that actually affected economic development. One system, one city, actually lost a bid for a poultry processing plant solely because of insufficient water supply. So in response to that, there was a Logan Water Advisory Group formed, and then the Logan Todd Regional Water Commission was formed. And from there, basically in 1999, 12 systems had agreed to purchase their water from the Logan Todd Regional Water Commission. So what does it look like from a governance standpoint? It's a 12-seat joint powers agency, and each system has a seat. And then that central treatment facility covers all 12 systems. And each system serves between 300 and 3,300 customers, but most of them are very small, serving less than 1,000 people. And as a result of this, from a financial standpoint, it equalized the wholesale rates for all 12 systems, regardless of their size or location. So from a funding perspective, it was $70 million. There were a lot of different funding sources involved, and these were really just two of them. They were two of the loans that were involved. What were the impacts after the fact? Well, the aluminum industry came to town. There's currently one big aluminum manufacturing plant that's open and one that's slated to open in 2020. And it's estimated that it's going to have about an $800 million impact on the community in the region. And that was largely because the aluminum industry needs a reliable water source. So a lot of that is in response to this Regional Water Commission and this regional solution. So in terms of resources, the EFCs, all of them across the board, are really interested in creating resources. So we recently came out with a couple of unique resources related to mergers and regionalization. So the first one is this guidance for interlocal agreements. Once you get this PowerPoint, you can check it out at these links. We have both kind of the full-length version, which really goes into the nuances, and then the more condensed version. Just as a disclaimer, a lot of the examples are North Carolina specific, but some of the overall themes will translate across states. So it still might be something interesting to look at if you are considering going down this path. And hopefully by the end of the month, we should have another resource related to consolidation. Again, it's North Carolina specific, but it's helpful to know what to expect, what obstacles, things of that nature. In addition, at our website, we have all kinds of different tools, things to assess affordability, rate setting, all the stuff I was talking about earlier in terms of being innovative with your rates. You can do that by looking at our website and downloading some of those resources. So finally, last thing before one last polling question, I just wanted to make the case for innovation. So these case studies are just a glimpse into innovation. There's a lot more out there than I could cover in an hour and should cover for the sake of everyone on the other end of this webinar. And a lot of them might not be right for your system, but some of them might. Some of them could save costs. Some of them could provide water to challenging areas. Some of them could improve public health or financial viability. So basically, I'm just saying innovation doesn't have to mean something super crazy or super out there. It just means something outside the norm, and maybe that's just something even outside the norm for you or your system. So my little piece of parting advice is to do your research, ask questions, but don't be afraid to investigate the options and see what's out there. So from that, I'll roll into my last polling question, which is how likely are you to implement an innovation at your water system?
Great, so you should all see that polling question on your screen. So just give it a couple seconds to say whether you feel like you're very likely to implement an innovation, somewhat likely, not sure, or if you're in the neighborhood of somewhat unlikely or very unlikely. We're just going to give you a couple more seconds to think about that in the interest of time, and then we'll go ahead and share the results. So it looks like almost everyone has responded. So I'm going to close this poll in 3, 2, and 1. And it looks like there's actually quite a few people are in the very likely to somewhat likely range. 31% say somewhat, 14% say very, so that's very encouraging. 50% of people aren't sure, And very encouragingly, nobody is very unlikely to innovate. So that's a strong case for innovation. Austin, I think you were convincing in your push.
Wow, that's actually really shocking. I'm super glad to hear that. It's obviously awesome to hear that people are interested in implementing some of these things and maybe at least thinking about it. And I kind of wanted to lend that into just, if you are considering looking into innovations, and if that has to do with things like partnerships or financing, things that we consider kind of our bread and butter, I encourage you to reach out to request technical assistance. We'd be more than happy to help you out if you're a small system, and also just use the data that's available. So we have lots of data available through the EFCN rates data that is just readily available if you're interested in it. And with that, I know we are running short on time, so I'm not sure I'll have time to address questions now. But that's my contact information. Anyone is welcome to reach out to me, either for technical assistance or any questions going forward.
Okay, great. I think we can keep the line open for maybe just 2 minutes to cover a couple questions. Okay. But on your note about technical assistance, one thing that we can do right now is, if you know that you'd like some assistance looking into innovation and you know that you could really use some guidance getting the data, you can tell us here. If you click yes on this question, we'll email you with a link to our survey, and at that point we can put you in touch with an expert. So if you are definitely interested in technical assistance, don't hesitate to tell us here. I'm also, as we're speaking, going to send out a link to our evaluation survey. I think everybody's good on our poll here. But I'm going to send a link to our evaluation. If you don't have time to fill it out this second, we do send it out again in our follow-up. So there will be, room for you to fill that out after today. And on that note, Austin, there are 2 questions that are related to your first case study, and I think we can answer them kind of quickly. The first one is, do you happen to know the source of water for the kiosk, for the Redbird Mission kiosk? Was it through a bulk source or through a PWS, or do you happen to remember that off the top of your head?
So off the top of my head, I'm pretty sure, and I just kind of touched on it very briefly, but one of the main things that the engineer wanted to make sure they could do was get water from the local municipality. So I'm pretty sure that's coming from Clay County, but if that person wants to provide me with their actual contact information, I can kind of follow up with a definite, yes, it's Clay County. I know it's a local municipal source off the top of my head, but I can't remember exactly what that source was.
Okay. All right, perfect. I think that covers it. And yeah, we can definitely get in touch with the asker of that question after the webinar as well. Great. So on that note, if you did happen to ask a question and we didn't get to it, we will get back to you after the webinar via email. And again, please feel free to send us more questions. Austin, do you have any closing comments that you'd like to make before we conclude?
I don't think so. I just want to thank everyone for listening. I know that was pretty information dense, and I definitely ran down to the wire, so I appreciate everyone listening. And hopefully you found something interesting, something useful that you can hold on to and take back to your system. And again, if you ever have any questions or want to reach out, feel free to contact me.
All right. Have a great afternoon, everybody.